Pedro Gomez had always been the kind of person who believed in patience, taking a calm and measured approach to challenges. As a black police officer, he often found himself in situations that tested his ability to remain composed in the face of adversity. But when it came to his neighbor, Julie, the line had been crossed. Julie's persistent disrespect and entitled behavior were too much for Pedro to handle. It all began innocently enough. Julie had been using his pool, but at first, Pedro was willing to overlook the occasional trespass. He figured it was just an oversight. Maybe she thought she was allowed to use it or didn't realize it was private property. After all, Pedro wasn't the kind of person to make a scene over something trivial. But as weeks passed, Julie's behavior became more brazen and disrespectful. She didn't just swim once in a while. She treated the pool as her own personal retreat. She'd invite her friends over for loud parties and leave behind trash and debris, as if Pedro's hard-earned property was just an extension of public space. Pedro had asked her several times to stay away, trying to keep the peace. The first few times, he'd approached her kindly, but she simply laughed it off and ignored his request. Then, as his frustration grew, he became more direct. He explained that it was his private property, that he didn't appreciate the trespassing, and asked her to respect his boundaries. But Julie, with her entitled attitude, didn't seem to care. She'd respond with passive-aggressive remarks, occasionally throwing in a racial comment for good measure, undermining his authority because of his race. "It's not really your property," she'd say with a sneer. "You're just a black man. What do you really own anyway?" The insults stung, but what hurt even more was how deeply entrenched her prejudice seemed to be. Julie wasn't just using his pool. She was asserting a form of superiority over him, as if his property wasn't truly his because of the color of his skin. Pedro didn't know how many times he had to politely ask her to leave before he'd had enough. When she began letting her friends use the pool too, treating his personal space like a community resource, Pedro realized he wasn't dealing with someone who was simply ignorant. Julie's behavior was fueled by a deep-seated entitlement, one that disregarded his ownership and humanity. In frustration, Pedro called the police, but by the time they arrived, Julie would always have a flimsy excuse, and the situation would dissolve. Nothing changed. Julie continued her disregard for his space, and Pedro was left feeling powerless. He had tried every official route available, but each attempt had been brushed off, leaving him helpless. It was clear to Pedro that if he didn't do something drastic, Julie would never stop. And as a police officer, he knew how to get results when the system failed him. This time, he wouldn't just report her. He would do something that would make her realize the consequences of treating him with such blatant disrespect. Julie's actions were no longer a simple annoyance, they were personal, and Pedro knew exactly what he needed to do to make sure Julie learned her lesson once and for all. Pedro had always believed in the power of justice, but justice wasn't always black and white. Sometimes, the most effective lessons came from forcing someone to experience the consequences of their own behavior in a way they could never ignore. Pedro thought long and hard about how to make Julie see things from a different perspective, one that would teach her the real impact of her racism, her entitlement, and her complete disregard for the boundaries of others. He needed a plan that would make her feel uncomfortable, but not physically harmed. It had to be something that would shift her view of the world, if only for a brief moment. After thinking over the situation, Pedro came up with an idea that was as unconventional as it was poetic. Julie's favorite thing about his property wasn't just the pool, it was the ability to flaunt her power and superiority. She felt untouchable, as if nothing could challenge her privilege. What better way to challenge that perception than by forcing her to experience what it was like to be treated as less than? Pedro knew that Julie's prejudices ran deep, and it wasn't enough just to confront her with words or actions. He needed to make her feel what it was like to be viewed differently because of the color of her skin. To do this, Pedro decided to use the very thing Julie adored, his pool, but with a twist. He carefully sourced a harmless but effective chemical compound, one that would temporarily alter the appearance of someone's skin without causing any lasting damage. The compound would cause a temporary darkening of the skin, giving Julie a taste of what it felt like to be perceived differently. He had heard about such substances before, and while they weren't widely known, they were safe when used properly. Pedro wasn't looking to punish her physically. He didn't want to cause lasting harm. Instead, he wanted her to face an uncomfortable truth. The plan wasn't malicious. It was meant to make Julie confront her own bias in a way that would be impossible to ignore. He hoped that for a brief moment, Julie would experience the unease, discomfort, and fear that many people of color felt on a daily basis, simply because of their skin color. Pedro spent the evening preparing the pool, applying the substance to the water so that it would gradually take effect when Julie jumped in the next morning. He could already imagine the look of confusion and panic on her face when she saw her skin begin to darken. The thought of Julie squirming in her own skin, struggling to explain herself as she suddenly became a target of her own prejudice, gave Pedro a sense of justice. As he stood inside his home, watching the sun begin to rise, Pedro felt confident in his plan. This would be the day that Julie would realize the impact of her actions. She had taken so much for granted, but now it was time for her to experience a shift in perspective, a reminder of how destructive racism could be when left unchecked. It wasn't about revenge for Pedro. It was about making sure Julie would think twice before ever treating anyone with the same ignorance and disrespect again. Julie had woken up that morning with the same sense of entitlement that she always carried. Her daily routine involved little more than lounging by Pedro's pool, which, in her mind, was hers for the taking. She had already decided it would be another perfect day to enjoy the sun, away from the responsibilities that seemed to burden her. She smiled smugly to herself as she grabbed her towel and headed toward Pedro's house. The fence creaked as she stepped through, casually ignoring the fact that she was trespassing. It was clear that Julie felt no need to ask for permission. She was simply entitled to the space, or so she thought. She tossed her towel onto a lounge chair and quickly disrobed, ready to soak up the sun in peace. The pool water gleamed invitingly as she dipped her toe in, relishing in the coolness of the water against her skin. She didn't notice anything unusual about the pool that morning. In fact, it felt just as refreshing as always. Julie slid into the water with ease, relishing in the sense of calm she always found there. The weight of her daily prejudices seemed to melt away, leaving her blissfully unaware of the consequences of her actions. But that comfort was fleeting. As soon as she submerged herself, she felt a strange sensation, a slight tingling across her skin, almost as if her body were reacting to the water in a way it never had before. The feeling grew stronger, and her body began to feel tight, as though the water itself were affecting her from the inside out. The odd sensation made her skin prickle. She looked down, expecting to see the familiar tan she had worked so hard for, but what she saw was not what she expected. Julie's skin was darkening, slowly at first, as if someone had switched the hues of a painting in progress. The transformation was so gradual that at first, she thought it was just her imagination. But as the minutes passed, the change became undeniable. She raised a trembling hand to her face, feeling the smoothness of her skin, which had now taken on a deep, unfamiliar tone. Her heart raced as she splashed water in an attempt to wash off the strange discoloration. But no matter how hard she scrubbed, the transformation only intensified. Panic began to take hold of her as she scrambled out of the pool, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the fear was overwhelming. Her hands shook as she looked at her now darker skin, and she felt her breath quicken, heart pounding in her chest. "What's happening to me?" she screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. "What is this?" She stumbled on the concrete, her legs weak with fear, her mind struggling to comprehend the situation. It felt like an assault on her identity. Julie had always looked at people of color with disdain, seeing them as inferior or, at best, as other. Now, here she was, experiencing what it felt like to be the very thing she had so often mocked and belittled. The reality of the situation was hitting her in a way she wasn't prepared for. She was no longer the woman in control. She was no longer the one who was seen as superior. The world she had once dominated with her prejudice was now flipped on its head. Her own reflection, her skin, no longer matched the image she had cultivated of herself. She was no longer in charge of the situation, and for the first time, Julie was forced to see the world from a perspective she had long ignored. The terror and disbelief were overwhelming. Julie could no longer hold onto the facade of superiority she had clung to for so long. The experience was jarring, a reminder of how dehumanizing it could feel to be judged based on appearance alone. And in that moment, Julie understood something she had never truly grasped before. Being the object of racism was terrifying. As Julie stood trembling in the middle of Pedro's backyard, her mind scrambled to find an explanation. The transformation had happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, that she couldn't process it fully. Panic took over, and she acted without thinking. She fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with sweat, and dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she stammered out her frantic words. "Someone is trying to hurt me," she shouted, her voice quivering with fear. "I don't know what's happening, but I've been poisoned or something. My skin is changing." She paused to catch her breath, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of the chaos. "I don't know why this is happening, but I'm changing color. I'm turning dark. I need help." The 911 operator, on the other end of the line, attempted to calm Julie down. "Ma'am, please take a deep breath. What do you mean your skin is changing? Can you tell me where you are?" But Julie couldn't make sense of it. The panic was too overwhelming, and her mind couldn't process the reality of what she was experiencing. All she knew was that she was terrified and out of control. "Please, help me. I don't know what to do. This can't be happening," she cried, her words tumbling out in a disjointed frenzy. The operator tried again to reassure her. "Ma'am, I understand you're frightened. Just stay calm. We're sending help to your location. Try to stay inside and stay safe." But Julie wasn't listening. Her mind was spiraling. The fear she was feeling was unlike anything she had ever encountered before. As she looked down at her darkened skin, she realized she was experiencing a fraction of the helplessness, the vulnerability, and the discomfort that people of color face on a daily basis, an overwhelming feeling of being trapped in a body that others viewed with disdain. Julie's breath hitched as she clutched the phone tighter, but the panic wasn't subsiding. "Please, you have to hurry," she pleaded, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I don't know how to stop this. It's like I've been attacked, and I don't even know who's doing it." In her desperation, Julie couldn't fathom that the very thing she was accusing someone of doing to her, causing her harm, was the result of her own actions. She was too consumed by her fear to realize that the universe had handed her a lesson in a way she never anticipated. She was now a victim of her own ignorance, facing a situation she would never have imagined herself in. Meanwhile, Pedro remained calm in his house, watching the unfolding chaos. He had expected the panic, the fear, but he also knew this was the first step in Julie's learning process. The sound of the sirens growing closer only confirmed that the moment of reckoning was near. Julie had no idea how deep the lesson would run, but Pedro was confident that she would never forget the taste of her own prejudice. Minutes after Julie's frantic 911 call, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. Julie, still in the throes of her panic, stood at the edge of the backyard, her skin still an unsettling shade of dark brown. The officers quickly surveyed the scene, their eyes darting between Julie, who was frantically waving her hands and claiming she had been poisoned, and Pedro, who remained composed as always. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened?" one of the officers asked Julie, trying to make sense of her chaotic narrative. Julie, still visibly shaken, explained that she'd been swimming in Pedro's pool when her skin started to change color. She claimed that someone must have tampered with the water, poisoning it and causing the discoloration. But as her story unfolded, it became clear that something didn't add up. Her words were scattered, and her fear seemed less about the actual situation and more about her own inability to control it. Pedro, unfazed by the drama unfolding in front of him, calmly interjected. He explained how Julie had been warned repeatedly about trespassing in his backyard. He also detailed her past behavior, her racist comments, her history of belittling people of color, and how her actions had been well documented. Julie had always seen herself as superior to those around her, but now her sense of control was slipping through her fingers like sand. The officers exchanged glances, sensing that there was more to the story than what Julie was letting on. They began questioning her further, trying to piece together the situation. Julie's discomfort grew with each probing question. Her responses became more defensive, and her previously composed demeanor shattered. The officers noticed how out of place her usual entitlement seemed now, as if it had been completely erased by the situation. Julie's usual calm, which came from knowing she was the one in control, was now replaced by uncertainty. She didn't know how to explain what was happening to her, or worse, how to justify her past behavior. Her mind raced to find an explanation, anything to avoid facing the reality of what was unfolding. The officers were seeing her for what she truly was, a woman whose privileged life had left her blind to the struggles of others, and now, that very privilege had been turned against her. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us," the officer said, his tone not unkind but firm. The police had seen enough. Julie's credibility had begun to crumble, and her frantic explanation didn't hold up. Pedro's calm, factual recounting of events had swayed the officers, and as they looked at Julie, they couldn't ignore the truth staring them in the face. Despite her protests, the officers knew that Julie's behavior had caught up with her. The situation wasn't just strange. It was a wake-up call, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever believed that privilege could shield them from accountability. Pedro had quietly turned the tables, and in doing so, he had forced Julie to face the very discomfort she had so often inflicted on others. The world she had known, one where she was always the one in control, had come crashing down. In the days that followed the incident, Julie's life quickly spiraled into a public spectacle. The story of her bizarre transformation spread like wildfire, and before long, the entire neighborhood knew about the strange incident that had left her humiliated. It wasn't just her skin color that was the topic of conversation, it was the shocking realization that Julie, the woman who had always looked down on others, was now the one who had been forced to reckon with her own actions. Her temporary transformation had become the talk of the block, with neighbors gossiping about how she had always belittled others, especially people of color. They spoke in hushed tones about the years of subtle racism they had witnessed but never spoken up about. Julie had lived in a bubble, her arrogance and privilege shielding her from any real consequences. But now that bubble had burst. The neighbors who had once quietly tolerated her presence began to distance themselves. People who had smiled at her in passing were now avoiding eye contact. Her behavior, once overlooked or dismissed, was now impossible to ignore. Julie's racism had been exposed, and the public fallout was swift and unforgiving. What had once been whispered behind her back was now laid bare for everyone to see. Pedro, for his part, remained quiet. He watched from a distance, taking no satisfaction in Julie's suffering but feeling a quiet sense of vindication. He had never sought revenge. His goal had always been to teach her a lesson, to show her the truth she had long been blind to. The pool incident had been his unconventional way of making Julie face the reality of her prejudice. Julie's experience was a momentary one. Her skin would eventually return to its original tone, and the physical transformation would fade into the background of her life. But the lesson she had learned, one that had been forced upon her, would stay with her forever. For the first time in her life, Julie had been made to feel uncomfortable in a way she could no longer deny. The privilege that had always shielded her was gone, and in its place was the raw, unfiltered truth that no one, no matter how powerful or entitled, is exempt from the consequences of their actions. The public humiliation Julie faced was the perfect karmic retribution. It wasn't just about her skin changing color, it was about the way her world had been flipped upside down. Pedro's quiet justice had been served, and Julie, whether she liked it or not, would have to live with the reality of what had happened. The lesson was clear. Racism, no matter how subtle, has consequences, and in the end, Julie had been made to face those consequences in the most unexpected of ways. For Pedro, the satisfaction wasn't in seeing Julie suffer, it was in knowing that his message had been delivered, loud and clear. The lesson would last far longer than the effects of the pool water, and Julie would never forget the taste of her own karma.